Hello everyone, thank you for joining me and welcome to my channel. I know it seems like a really long time since I've launched a video, and you're right, it's been almost 6 weeks. I had a little bit of a health issue in July which resulted in some surgery, and everything's fine, I'm fine, but it did knock me onto my backside for a few weeks, so I'm happy to be back in my chair and producing some content for you all. In today's video we're going to stay in the dining room, and I'm going to attempt to create some chairs to match the table that I made in my last video. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I did use my Cricut for one of the pieces for the chair, but don't despair. If you don't have a Cricut or a cutting system, that's fine. There's lots of alternatives that you can use for the piece that I created, and I'll share those with you in the video. As always, your cutting instructions will be in the description box below, so without any further ado, let's get started. So we're going to start with piece A, which is what we're going to make the back legs and the back rest from. So we're going to do some measurements before we start cutting. Starting from one of the short sides, which is going to be the top, we're going to make some measurements across from left to right. So starting with Imperial measurements, you're going to go in 1/8 of an inch, and then 3/8 of an inch, and then 5/8 of an inch. And in metric, that's 3 millimeters, 10 millimeters, and 17 millimeters. I'm also putting a little arrow here so I remember which one is the top and which is the bottom. Moving down to the bottom, our measurements are 1/4 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch, and 1/2 of an inch, or 6 millimeters, 10 millimeters, and 13 millimeters. Now moving over to the side, we're going to make one measurement, and this is from the top. We're going to go down 2 inches, or 51 millimeters. You can make that same measurement down on the other side, just so that you can make a line straight across. While you're drawing that line across, you can find your center point between the two sides, which is at 3/8 of an inch or 10 millimeters. Mark that center point with a dot. So we need to draw some lines next. So our first line is going to go right from the top left corner down to the first notch over, which is the 1/4 inch mark or the 6 millimeter mark on the bottom. Now this can be a little bit tricky. If you put your ruler right on that corner, you're probably not going to leave enough room for your pencil mark. So hopefully you have a nice sharp pencil, but you might have to come in about 1/2 millimeter maybe from the top, just so that you have room for that pencil line. Do the same on the other side. So we're coming from the top right corner and going down to the 1/2 inch mark or the 13 millimeter mark on the bottom. You should have a V shape here now, with the smaller end of the V being at the bottom. The next line we're going to draw comes in from the top over to the 1/8 of an inch mark and goes just down to that dot that you drew in the center. So this line does not go all the way to the bottom, it just goes a little better than half. And then we'll do the same thing from the other side, starting at the 5/8 mark or the 17 millimeter mark and coming down to that same center point dot. The last line that we're going to draw comes from that center point and goes down to the 3/8 of an inch mark at the bottom or the 10 millimeter mark at the bottom. If you're worried about getting your line straight, you can certainly use that measurement that you made at the top at the 3/8 mark. It really kind of depends on how comfortable you are with drawing from that center point. So now that all of our lines are drawn, we're going to cut away all the excess pieces that we don't need. So that thin sliver that we drew with our first lines from the corners down to the 1/4 and the 1/2 mark, we're going to cut those away because we don't need them. Your next cut should start at the center point of the top, which is at your 3/8 of an inch mark or your 10mm mark, and should go down to the bottom to the center, which again is 3/8 or 10mm at the bottom. This cut will go right through that center dot that you drew. Now from each of these two pieces, we're just going to take off that smaller upper triangle that's on the inside. So what you're left with then is just two angled pieces. And we know that one side is slightly longer than the other. So on the top side, that shorter piece is going to be where the legs of the chair are. And then the longer piece here will be the backrest for the chair. These two pieces are going to need a good sanding. I like to try and keep them together if I can. That way when I'm sanding, I'm not sanding one side smaller than the other. So I'm just starting by sanding down those rough edges where the cuts were. And then I'm also going to take off any of the sharp corners on all four sides of each piece. So here we are, all sanded and smooth, and those sharp edges are gone. We're moving on to the seat chair next. So this is part B, and you can see that one edge is slightly longer than the other. Those longer edges are the front and back of the chair, and of course the shorter edges will be the two sides. Now you can see that I have cut so that the grain of the wood goes from back to front. That's just a personal preference of mine. It's really up to you, but because this piece is going to be stained, you are going to see the wood grain for the seat. So I've given this piece a sand as well, and so I've taken off again all those really sharp lines at the edges. I'm also going to notch out on the back of the chair seat where the legs will sit in. So the width of the wood that I used for piece A is the 3/32 of an inch, which is about 2.5mm in width. So I'm measuring in from each side of that longer side, just shy of 3mm. The reason I'm not doing it exactly 2.5mm is, believe it or not, glue will add width to that piece, and I really want it to be flush once they're kind of inserted into that notch. So my next measurement is going to be how wide that leg is going to be. So I'm just down at the bottom end, which is the shorter side, and that distance across from where it comes to a point to the flat side of that chair leg is about 6mm in width. And so when I measure down onto the back of the chair back, I'm going to go down just a hair more than 6mm. So I'm going to go ahead and cut those notches out. I always recommend when you're cutting wood pieces that you cut against the grain first. because if you go with the grain, oftentimes it'll split on you and it'll go a little bit farther than you intended. So by cutting it off, by going across the grain first, you lessen the possibility that that's going to happen. So you can go ahead and test or dry fit now just to make sure that you've cut the right measurement there. And again, don't worry if it's a hair bigger than the leg. As I said, that glue is going to take up just a tiny bit of space. Go ahead and notch out that other side. The front two legs of the chair will be different from the back. And to make those two legs, I'm using these stairway spindles and just cutting them down to size. The size of those front legs will be 1 3/8 of an inch long, or 35 millimeters. I've already cut off the smaller tip off of this because I want this rounded piece to be the bottom of the chair leg. So I'm just sanding off any kind of rough edges here. I'm measuring the correct length for the leg and just making a mark so I know where to cut. I'm using my miter box and saw here to cut these legs off. Using the miter saw makes sure that those cuts are straight across. I also have a little trick to make sure that all of the legs are exactly the same size. Now once you've lined that line up with where you're going to cut, if you take a block of wood and push it up nice and snug against that leg, you can clamp that piece of wood in place. From that point on, you don't have to measure. All you have to do is push the leg up against that piece of wood and they should all come out exactly the same size. Now you could just repeat that process with the next leg. I would recommend that if you're making more than one chair, which I'm assuming you will, that you'll cut all of your legs at the same time. That way they're all going to be the same on all of the different chairs. Here's the two pieces together. Next I'm going to make the chair back. So I've taken piece C here, and I don't want the chair back to be straight across. So the first thing that I've done is I've cut out just a little template from some graph paper of the exact same size as piece C. I'm folding it in half, and then I'm just going to draw a curved line. Then I'm cutting out that shape with a pair of scissors. Now when I unfold it, both sides look exactly the same. I laid the template back onto the piece of wood, and now I'm just going to take a pencil and I'm going to trace out that design onto the wood. And using my X-Acto knife, I cut out that design. Now I would suggest going very slow here because you don't want the wood to split. So I just kind of started by just doing a light score first of all. That helps to guide my blade when I go back and do multiple passes, which typically you'll end up having to do here. I think I did like 6 or 7 passes before I actually had it cut out. After it was all cut out, I had to go in with some sandpaper and just take off some of those rough edges. I also rounded off all of the sharper corners so that it's nice and smooth. The second piece for the back is piece marked D, and I'm not going to change the shape of this piece at all. I'm just going to make sure it's well sanded. Now I haven't glued them in yet, but I wanted to show you that those two pieces are going to sit in between those two side pieces. I also wanted to give you some options for some different slats that you might want to put in between the two. So you can use these small bamboo cocktail sticks. I also have some craft matchsticks that will work well, and you can put 4 or 5 across of those. And then I also have these very thin, small coffee stir sticks. They're about 4 millimeters in width by about 1 millimeter. This is the brand that I use. This box will last me forever. There's so many in there, and I just got them off of Amazon. So those can be used as well for your back slats. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different, maybe a little bit fancier. And so I'm going to show you what I did, but please feel free to make whichever back you would like to make. Now I understand that not everybody has a cutting system. However, I do have a Cricut, and I don't typically use my Cricut when I'm doing tutorials because not everybody has a system. However, because there are other options, I felt it was okay to at least give you some other options, but show you what I did anyway. So I found this little flower pattern on Google Images, and I uploaded it to my design space, and I cut it out just out of some medium grade cardstock. I did find that I had to make 3 layers though of each of the flowers in order to give it enough structure and enough strength to use as a back for the back of the chair. So now that I have all of my pieces cut, it's time to start assembling the chair. Now I've gone in and measured on the long side exactly where the bottom of the seat will sit, so that those chair legs, which are 1 3/8 of an inch long, are all going to be even and the chair's not going to wobble. So measuring from the left side or the smaller side up, the 1 3/8 of an inch or 35 millimeters. I'm making a second line that's 3/32 of an inch or about 2.5 millimeters up from that first line. And so the chair base will sit right in between those 2 lines. And of course we want to do that on both sides. So I'm going to start by attaching the front legs. And originally I had put those legs in about 2 millimeters from each side. But once I had the sides on, I thought it looked odd because the front legs and the back legs did not line up. So I took them off and started over. And this time I'm going to put those front legs flush with the corner of the front of the seat. So the trick is to make sure that they're straight up and down. So if you need to use a 1, 2, 3 block or something that's square, like the little ruler that I use, just to make sure that you're checking to make sure it's straight up and down and nothing is kind of tipped off to the side. Here's a little bit better angle for you. Now I'm going to add the back legs or the back support to the back of the seat. And this bottom section should be the exact same length as the front legs. So just adding some glue into that cutout section. And then we'll just slide that side piece into that little notch. And I'm using my 1, 2, 3 block again here just to make sure that the seat remains square with the back of the leg. I've glued on both sides now, so here's a better view of how it should look. So I'm moving on to the backrest now. So I did want to put just a little bit more detail on this piece, so I went in with a pencil and just drew a very, very simple design. And then I took my smallest ball stylus and I just pushed in where those pencil lines are and just basically made a little bit. It looks like it's carved, but it's not in there very deep. In fact, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see it even after I've painted it, but I'm hoping so. And then I did also a very simple little design on this bottom piece. This is piece number D. I didn't have room for the little loop in the middle, but I thought I'd put just a little bit of a scroll in there as well. So I measured up and marked about 5 millimeters up from the top of the seat up on each side. That'll help me keep this bottom piece D nice and even when I glue it in. The next piece to go in is this little flower design. So I'm just adding a little bit of glue just to the points of the flower that I think are going to touch the frame. Then I'm placing that flower right directly on top of piece D and in between the two sides. And now I can add the last piece. So I'm going to put a little bit of glue on the very top of the flower and then on the two sides of the brace as well. Before I paint the chair, I'm going to go in with a little bit of wood filler here and just fill in some of these ridges on the flower. I also want to put some bracing down around the legs, and for that I'm going to be using these round toothpicks. You'll notice I didn't give you any measurements for how long these toothpicks are going to be, and that's because it's easier at this point to just go in and measure each of those spaces individually. Now there's no set rule as to exactly where these braces need to be. I just went up about 3/8 of an inch or about 10 millimeters from the bottom. Now that it's all put together, it's time to do some painting. Now I want this chair to match the dining room table, obviously. So I'm going to be doing the seat of the chair in the dark brown, and then I'm going to paint the rest of the chair white. So for the seat, I used this burnt umber, and I did add a little bit of water to make more of a stain than a paint. And before I painted the flower, because it's made out of paper, I put a coat of gesso on first. And then I painted the remainder of the chair white. I had to use about 3 coats to get full coverage, and then I went over the whole thing with 2 coats of Glossy Podge. So here's the finished chair. I'm very pleased with how well this came out. I think it's going to match the dining room table very well. As always, thank you very much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. I only have 11 more of these to make, so I better get busy. We'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.